You could hear a pin drop. The lights in the hearing room buzzed faintly, but every breath was held. And then she spoke. "Let the record reflect," Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, her voice steady, "that not a single hand was raised in support of ripping children from their parents." The camera panned across the room. Even Tom Homan, once the iron-faced architect of border enforcement, refused to meet her eyes. Then came the blow no one saw coming. A single document held high. A memo. Dated, signed, cold, clinical, deadly. "Your name is on this," she said, her finger tapping the signature like a gavel. "You didn't just enforce cruelty, you recommended it." What followed wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning, not just with policy, but with the very question of who we choose to be when the world isn't watching. This is a dramatized reconstruction based on real events, real documents, and real consequences. While some scenes have been fictionalized for emotional impact, every truth it aims to reveal about power, about silence, about human dignity is rooted in the lived pain of thousands. Because while the story may be crafted, the outrage is real. The voices echoing through those halls, they haven't faded, they've only grown louder. The hearing room was too quiet, not the reverent kind of silence, but the kind that buzzed with a tension no one dared name. The walls were pale, almost sterile, as if trying to mask the history they were about to bear witness to. Rows of officials sat in suits that blurred into the beige, their hands folded, expressions neutral, eyes forward. Cameras hummed softly. Live feed running. America was watching, even if it didn't know what it was waiting for. At the far end of the dais, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat still. Not stiff, still, like a coiled wire just beneath the surface. Her hair was pulled back, neat but not performative. No theatrics, just presence. Before her lay a folder thick with papers, but she wasn't rifling through them. She was studying, slow and deliberate, as if weighing the weight of each word. Inside the folder was a memo, faintly yellowed at the edge. Date, April 23, 2018. Subject, increasing prosecutions of immigration violations. 3 authors, 1 signature circled in red ink. Tom Homan. She turned the page. A photocopied statement, handwritten in shaky Spanish, described a mother separated from her 2-year-old at a border checkpoint. No translator, no lawyer, just screaming, and then silence. She turned another page. A black and white photo of a boy, maybe 6, holding on to chain-link fencing, wide-eyed, shirt half-buttoned. The caption beneath read, "El Paso Processing Center, July 2018. AOC didn't flinch, but her grip on the pen tightened. Behind her calm expression, a decision had already been made. But she wasn't going to start with fire, not yet. First, she'd let the silence speak. Across the room, Tom Homan sat 3 chairs from center. He looked older than the last time she saw him in person. The suit was tailored, the tie dark blue. But the body language, slightly hunched, hands clasped tight, betrayed something else. A man rehearsing a defense he knew might not land. He hadn't seen the memo yet, at least not in this room, not under these lights. AOC closed the folder softly, not with finality but with intent. This wasn't a show. This wasn't a press stunt. This was the moment truth would become undeniable, in front of the cameras, under oath, on the record. A clerk called the session to order. "This committee will now come to order. Today's hearing concerns the implementation and legal rationale of the family separation policy enacted by federal agencies beginning in 2018. AOC barely heard the rest. Her eyes scanned the room, not for allies, but for signs. Who would fidget first? Who would look down when the pictures came out? Who still believed silence protected them? Then, click. Her pen hit the table as she uncapped it. The sound was small but sharp, like a trigger pulled. What she was about to do wasn't just confrontation, it was excavation. She wasn't here to make speeches. She was here to dig something out of the floorboards of American bureaucracy and lay it bare under the lights. The woman next to her whispered, "Are you sure about this?" AOC didn't look at her. Instead, she whispered back, "It's not about being sure. It's about not being able to look away anymore." Outside the hearing room, reporters waited. Phones buzzed in pockets. No one knew yet that in just a few minutes, a single question was going to detonate the room. Not with shouting, but with something much harder to dismiss. Proof. And the signature of the man now straightening his tie across the aisle. The clerk had barely finished reading the agenda when AOC leaned slightly forward in her seat, not to interrupt, not to posture, but because she could feel the moment slipping into routine. And this day was not going to be routine. She waited just long enough for the last gavel tap to echo off the high-ceiling walls before pressing the mic button in front of her. A small green light blinked on. Eyes turned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Before we proceed, I'd like to ask a simple question of the panel. Some rustled their notes. Others sat up straighter, unsure what direction this was headed. Tom Homan looked down for a second. Too long for coincidence. Can you please raise your hand if you believe that the policy of family separation effectively deters unlawful migration to the United States? Silence. No one moved. Not one of the 6 witnesses, former agency heads, legal experts, appointed consultants, lifted a hand. One man opened his mouth slightly, then shut it again. A woman near the end of the table blinked 3 times in quick succession and glanced sideways as if silently asking, "Are you going to answer that, or am I?" Still, no hands. AOC waited. She didn't rush it. Let them sit in it. Let the weight of the question settle not just in the room, but in the public record. Cameras were already zooming in. Someone on Twitter had likely hit record the moment she spoke. She could feel the air starting to shift, subtly at first, like the pressure drop before a summer storm. She sat back, lifted the mic again, and said calmly, "Let the record reflect that not a single hand was raised in defense of the practice of separating children from their parents at the southern border." There it was. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence was the sound. And suddenly, this wasn't a hearing anymore. It was an indictment against policy, against silence, against the idea that trauma could be buried under bureaucratic language. A ripple went through the chamber, not of noise, but of posture. People sat up. Assistants stopped typing. One congressman 2 rows down leaned over to whisper something to his aide, and the aide, without being asked, pulled out his phone. AOC continued, her voice steady, with the rhythm of someone who had already gone through the outrage long before today. Not one hand, not one defense, and yet thousands of children were taken, some lost for weeks, others for months, and some never returned. She didn't say it dramatically. She said it like someone who had read every line of the case files and refused to forget even one. Across the panel, Tom Homan blinked hard. He shifted in his chair. He hadn't expected the opening salvo to be this quiet, this simple, and yet this devastating. What was he going to say now? That he almost raised his hand? The power of the moment wasn't in accusation. It was in exposure. When no one stands up for a policy that affected thousands of lives, what does that say about the policy? Or the people who carried it out? The hearing went on, but from that point forward, everything had changed. The cameras would stay on her longer. The hashtags would multiply. Viewers at home, some still in their pajamas or making breakfast, would pause mid-scroll, because somewhere between silence and a single sentence, AOC had just turned the hearing into history, and the real confrontation hadn't even begun. She let the silence hang a second longer, long enough for the lack of hands to imprint itself into the public record. Then AOC reached forward and opened her folder again, slow and deliberate, like someone turning over a final puzzle piece. Her fingers stopped on a sheet marked not in handwriting, but in the dense, deliberate font of government formatting. Bolded header, numbered paragraphs, formal tone, cold as steel. She lifted it just enough for the committee to see. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit into the record a memorandum dated April 23rd, 2018. There was a small murmur behind her, someone flipping through their own binder to find it, someone else catching the date and freezing mid-motion. AOC didn't wait for permission. She read straight into the mic. Subject: Increasing prosecutions of immigration violations. Issued by the Department of Homeland Security. The memo outlines 3 possible approaches. Option 3, recommends full prosecution of all adults crossing the southern border, including those presenting at ports of entry seeking asylum. She paused. The room was still. Then she looked up. Not at the chairman, not at her colleagues. Straight at Tom Homan. This memo was signed by 3 individuals. One of those signatures is yours. She didn't raise her voice. There was no need. Her tone was exact, clean, measured, like someone setting down a piece of evidence in front of a jury. Tom Homan didn't flinch, but he didn't look at her either. He stared forward, unmoving. His lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. The cameras caught everything. AOC turned the page over, showed the highlighted section to the clerk, and repeated the sentence with surgical clarity. It is hereby recommended that the department pursue prosecution of all amenable adults who cross our border illegally, including those presenting with a family unit. And then, with a slight tilt of her voice, this recommendation, Mr. Homan, included the deliberate separation of children from their parents as a direct consequence of criminal referral. Did it not? He opened his mouth. Closed it. The pause was less than a second, but in a room like this, under lights like these, it was long enough to be replayed on loop for days. AOC didn't press yet. She didn't need to. The memo was already working on its own. Words on paper had become something else entirely. A mirror. And in that mirror was a signature. Signed, Thomas D. Homan, then Acting Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken with the finality of a courtroom verdict. Somewhere in the media gallery, a reporter was already typing. In another tab, the live stream clip was being clipped, time-stamped, and shared. By the time Homan cleared his throat, the headline was already forming. AOC confronts Homan with memo bearing his name. Family separation wasn't an accident. It was a recommendation. And this time he couldn't say he didn't know, because his name was on it. The heat in the room hadn't risen, but the energy had changed. After the memo, there was no more ambiguity. The committee wasn't just asking questions. It was holding receipts. Tom Homan adjusted his mic, cleared his throat, and sat slightly forward in his chair. Gone was the silent tension of a man waiting for a storm. Now he was in it, and his posture shifted into something practiced. This was a man who'd testified before, who'd been through tough interviews, who knew how to speak with confidence even when the ground beneath him had started to crack. "Let me be clear," Homan began, voice measured, jaw tight. "What we implemented was consistent with standard law enforcement practices across this country. When a parent commits a crime and is arrested, they are separated from their children. That's not controversial. That's how the system works." There was a pause. "It wasn't a bad start, if you didn't look too closely," he continued. "If I get arrested for driving under the influence with a child in the back seat, that child is removed. If someone is taken in for domestic violence and a child is present, that child is removed. Family separation is not new. It's law enforcement protocol." He leaned back as if he'd just made the closing argument in a debate. A few heads nodded faintly, likely staffers prepped to stay neutral. But AOC didn't wait for the sound to settle. She leaned in again, voice cool, but unmistakably sharper than before. "Mr. Homan, let's stop right there, because this wasn't law enforcement. This was cruelty, engineered." Her tone cut through the air, not loud but piercing in its precision. "You didn't arrest parents for domestic violence. You arrested them for showing up to a port of entry and asking for protection. And then, instead of processing their cases legally, you took their children and called it policy." Homan tried to jump back in, but she kept going. "You're comparing asylum-seeking mothers fleeing war and violence to drunk drivers and abusers. That's not just inaccurate, it's morally bankrupt." The room stiffened. Even those who had been looking down at notes now looked up. Homan raised his hand slightly, asking for space to respond. He got it. "Congresswoman, I'm not saying asylum is a crime. I'm saying entering illegally, outside of a port of entry, is a violation of federal law. That's Title 8, Section 1325. It's been on the books for decades." AOC nodded almost thoughtfully. Then she replied, "And yet, Mr. Homan, Title 8 does not cancel out international asylum law. which states that a person fleeing persecution has the right to seek protection, regardless of how they enter. The United States helped write that law. You don't get to enforce only the parts that are convenient. There it was, the turn. Seeking asylum is not a crime, she repeated slower this time. For the record, for the cameras, and for everyone at home trying to understand what this hearing was really about. Homan didn't respond immediately. He looked down, then back up, measured again. But the foundation had shifted. What he framed as standard operating procedure had just been exposed as a false equivalency, one that didn't hold when weighed against the lives it had upended. And the hearing? It wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about the moral imagination of a nation and whether bureaucratic language could ever justify the pain it produced. AOC didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had already made its own noise. She had let him speak. She had let him finish his rehearsed defense, his analogies about DUIs and domestic disputes. And now, as the room briefly settled, AOC picked up the memo again. Not to wave it, not to dramatize, but to remind the room of what was already in the record. She flipped to a page 3/4 of the way in. Her pen tapped the margin twice, quietly, like a clock ticking toward confrontation. "Mr. Homan," she began, tone neutral but unmistakably firmer, "you mentioned earlier that there were multiple options presented to then Secretary Nielsen regarding border prosecutions." He nodded once, cautious. "Correct. The department considered different approaches. That's standard." "Different approaches," she echoed, then looked back down. "Let's talk about option 3, outlined here in the April 23rd memo." She lifted her eyes not to the chairman, but directly at Homan. Option 3 was not just listed, it was explicitly recommended. It states, "Option 3 is the most effective means of achieving operational goals." That option, Mr. Homan, is the one that required family separation. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but stopped. His hand twitched toward his mic and then withdrew. "So just to be clear, option 3 was not an abstract idea. It was your team's preferred strategy. And the justification, operational goals. Not due process, not child welfare, not even legal necessity." He blinked. She gave him space. "Would you like to clarify whether or not you endorsed option 3? "Congresswoman," Homan began, voice tighter than before, "what I can say is, we provided several paths forward to the secretary. It was ultimately her decision. And yet," AOC cut in gently, "your name appears not just as a contributor, but under the section labeled recommendation. You didn't just list the options, you weighted them." She held up the page. "It's written plainly. Option 3 is recommended. And underneath that, your signature." Now he leaned forward, voice rising slightly. "I stand by the fact that we were trying to create deterrence that would reduce illegal crossings and save lives. The memo was part of a broader effort to what, Mr. Homan?" she asked. "To make desperation look like a threat? To treat asylum like a loophole instead of a legal right?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, visibly tense now. "That wasn't the intention. But it was the effect," she replied, swift and unrelenting. "You didn't just sign this memo. You gave it power." She let the words hang in the air. "You elevated option 3, the one that included the forced removal of children, as the path forward for this country. And thousands of families paid the price for that recommendation." The room was quiet again, not the quiet of inattention, but of gravity. Tom Homan sat back, his posture defensive, but his words suddenly scarce. The usual bureaucratic fallback, "We were following orders," wouldn't work here. Not when the paper trail led back to his desk, his signature, his judgment. AOC placed the memo back on her stack of documents as if shelving the evidence until the next exhibit. She didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She just looked at him and said, "The truth doesn't need to be shouted to be damning. It just needs to be read." And that's what she had done. Read it, understood it, dissected it, and handed it back for the nation to witness. One signature, one decision, one calculated option at a time. There was a stillness again, but this time it wasn't passive. It was charged. As if everyone in the room, from staffers to spectators, instinctively knew that something irreversible was about to happen. AOC reached slowly into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a red Sharpie. Not black, not blue, red. It wasn't for effect. It was for clarity, for what couldn't be erased or hidden beneath the dull tones of bureaucracy. She opened the cap without a word. Her hand hovered for just a moment over the memo that lay before her, the one dated April 23, 2018, stamped with the cold efficiency of federal process, signed at the bottom by three men. She circled the name deliberately, Thomas D. Homan. The red ink bled slightly into the cheap government paper, forming a bold, unmistakable ring, and then she said it. "This ink? This isn't policy. This is blood." The words landed with a weight that paper alone couldn't carry. Audible gasps rose from the back of the chamber. Someone dropped a pen. On the press bench, a reporter didn't even blink as they began typing. Fast, fingers flying. Screens lit up as phones were raised in near synchrony. AOC hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The sentence had hit like a verdict. Tom Homan froze. He didn't reach for the mic. He didn't look at the document. His hands stayed perfectly still on the table. The kind of stillness that comes not from confidence, but from knowing any motion might be read as guilt. AOC didn't press him further. She didn't need another question. The signature had already spoken. What followed wasn't about procedure anymore. It wasn't about agency flowcharts or enforcement justifications. It had become something else. A reckoning, not only of decisions made, but of what those decisions cost. "Every time we sanitize suffering with legalese," she continued, eyes never leaving the panel, "we make it easier to repeat, to normalize, to forget. But families don't forget. Children don't forget. And history certainly won't forget who signed what." The red circle stared back at them all. It wasn't dramatic. It was definitive. A mark that would appear in screenshots across Twitter, thumbnails across YouTube, and headlines by nightfall. In that moment, the hearing transformed. It was no longer a discussion of legality, or policy options, or national security. It was a moral confrontation, televised and irreversible. And with a single red line, AOC had reframed the entire narrative. Not as a question of government function, but of human cost. She capped the marker quietly and said only one more thing. "Paper hides things, but ink remembers." And so would everyone watching. AOC uncapped her pen again, not to mark, but to point. The red ink was still fresh on the memo, but now her attention turned to what made that memo possible in the first place. She knew the document didn't emerge in isolation. It was part of a machine, calculated, coordinated, and shielded by legal language that stretched just far enough to cover cruelty. If the signature had made the policy personal, the next step was making it undeniable. "Let's talk about how we got here," she said, her voice steady, but layered with something quieter. Grief. She placed another stack of papers on the table, each one marked not by DHS letterhead, but by the handwriting of pain, survivor letters, statements from parents, notes from legal aid workers, translations of scrawled pleas on scraps of paper smuggled out of detention facilities. She didn't lift them theatrically. She lifted them with reverence. This wasn't one bad decision. This was a series of deliberate steps, each one more detached from humanity than the last. She looked down at her notes and began outlining the chain of events. In May 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions publicly announced the Department of Justice's zero-tolerance policy. Every single person crossing the border outside official ports of entry, regardless of intent, was to be criminally prosecuted. That meant asylum seekers, mothers with children, toddlers in tow, no exceptions. She let the words breathe, then continued. Just days later, then Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen signed a memo implementing the directive. She claimed there was no family separation policy, that it wasn't deliberate, that it was just enforcement. AOC looked up. "But you don't accidentally separate 5,000 children from their parents." She held up a page. Not a memo, this time a letter. Handwritten, shaky, folded so many times it had lines like veins running through it. "This is from a woman named Myrna. She crossed into Texas with her 6-year-old son, fleeing cartel violence in Honduras. They were separated at intake. She was told he'd be taken to bathe. She didn't see him again for 73 days. No updates. No contact. When he was returned, he had bruises and no memory of how he got them. AOC's voice didn't waver, but the room had changed. Even those who had disagreed with her politically weren't scribbling notes anymore. There are thousands of stories like this, she continued, and in many cases there are no records, no dates of transfer, no chain of custody. The administration had no plan to reunite families. Because this wasn't a mistake, it was a message. She turned to the panel. The DOJ prosecuted, DHS carried it out, ICE detained, CBP enforced. Every agency passed the trauma down the line like an unwanted package. And when it finally landed on the doorstep of the American conscience, everyone said, "It wasn't me." Then she looked back at the memo. "But we know who recommended it, and we know who signed it." She paused, not for drama, but for dignity. You can write history in ink, but you don't erase it by pretending the pen wasn't in your hand. The red circle around Homan's name was still there. It hadn't faded. Neither had the memories of the families whose names no one ever bothered to write down. AOC didn't let the pause linger too long. The stories she had just read were still hanging heavy in the room, but she knew what often came next, the familiar pivot. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. It saved lives in the long run. It deterred future crossings. That word again? Deterrence. Cold, clean, convenient. It was the shield bureaucrats reached for when the consequences of their decisions came too close to human. She turned to face the panel, fingers laced loosely over the stack of documents in front of her. "Let's talk about deterrence," she began, her tone even but sharp. "Because I've read the memos, I've reviewed the policy briefs, and not once, not a single time, have I seen credible evidence that this strategy did anything but traumatize people." She flipped to a printed report and held it up slightly, the UN logo visible in the corner. "This is from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It states unequivocally that there is no empirical basis to support the idea that punitive measures like family separation reduce migration. What they do cause, however, is lasting psychological harm to children." She turned the page and continued. "This legal analysis from the American Immigration Council lays it out plainly. Families fleeing violence in Central America are driven by fear, not by loopholes. They're not gaming the system. They're running from it." She paused, then added more softly, "They're not responding to our laws. They're responding to the sound of gunfire outside their children's bedrooms." The room was quiet again, not stunned this time, but sobered. AOC knew the numbers weren't just numbers. They were evidence against a fiction that had gone unchallenged for too long. "Here's what deterrence really looked like," she said, holding up another paper. "This is a note from an ICE staffer, a whistleblower. Dated August 2018. She read it aloud, steady and deliberate. "Several children in our facility are not eating. One keeps repeating that his father is in jail and he must have done something wrong. He believes he will be punished next. Staff are unsure how to explain the situation without worsening his anxiety." She looked back up. "That's not deterrence. That's institutional trauma." Her voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in conviction. "If your policy relies on making children afraid, it's not a policy. It's a strategy of psychological warfare." She moved her hands slowly across the table, as if brushing away any remaining excuses. "And let's be clear. Even if family separation had reduced border crossings, which it didn't, it would still be wrong. Because deterrence is not justice. It's public relations with a body count." The words hit hard and she didn't soften them. She let the truth speak in the language it demanded, direct, unflinching, and unwilling to bow to the comfort of euphemism. She glanced toward the panel again. "You cannot claim the moral high ground while standing on the backs of frightened children." No one responded, not a word, not a sound. The silence was louder than denial, and AOC knew they had built a myth, and she was here to dismantle it, one documented fact, one unreturned child, one truth at a time. There are moments in this work that don't live on C-SPAN or in transcripts. They don't show up in press releases or get captured in sound bites, but they stay lodged in your ribs like splinters. AOC knew this hearing would draw attention, but what brought her to this day didn't begin under Capitol lights. It began on a blistering morning in Texas, just months into her first term, before the spotlight found her, before the systems realized she wouldn't be quiet. She'd flown to the border with a small group of lawmakers to inspect detention centers that had recently made headlines. Words like unsanitary, inhumane, unfit had been tossed around, but none of them prepared her for what she saw. It wasn't just the heat, it was the sound, or the lack of it. Children don't cry when they have already learned it won't change anything. Inside the processing facility, there were rows of silver thermal blankets crinkled over still bodies. Girls with tangled hair, boys with faces that didn't flinch anymore. She didn't take photos. It felt wrong, performative. So she walked quietly through the corridor, listening. And then, just beyond the edge of the outer fence, a woman locked eyes with her. No translator, no guards in between, just metal chain links and grief that didn't need words. The woman lunged forward and gripped AOC's hand through the fence. Tight, not desperate, but urgent. Her face was sun-worn, her eyes rimmed in red, but her voice cut straight through. They took my daughter. I don't know if she's alive. AOC froze, not out of fear, but because in that instant, she didn't see a stranger. She saw a mother who could have lived in the Bronx, a woman who could have been her aunt, her cousin, someone she passed on the subway, someone who wasn't weak but had been made invisible. The woman kept talking, rapid Spanish that tumbled out too fast to catch every word. But the meaning was clear. No updates, no lawyer, no goodbye, just silence. When a guard moved to pull them apart, AOC didn't let go right away. She looked the woman in the eye and whispered the only thing that felt honest. I will not forget you. Later that night, back in her hotel room, AOC sat on the edge of her bed and wept. Not performative tears, not for cameras or headlines. Quiet grief, the kind that creeps in after everyone else has gone home. She didn't cry because she was helpless. She cried because she had power now, and power comes with the weight of accountability. Back in the hearing room, she recounted the moment without drama. Her voice didn't crack. She didn't gesture wildly. She just told it exactly as it happened. I didn't see a stranger that day, she said. I saw a mother, like any mother. And in that moment, I saw myself. I saw every woman who's ever been made small by a system that pretends to forget her humanity. She let the words settle. No one interrupted. We built this system, which means we can dismantle it, and we must. Because a country that loses its empathy doesn't just fail others, it loses its soul. And in that sentence, she made it clear. This wasn't about scoring political points. This was about recovering something this country had allowed itself to forget, the human face behind the headlines. AOC didn't move to her next question right away. She reached down into her folder again, but this time it wasn't a memo or a legal brief. She carefully unfolded a thin, slightly crumpled piece of paper. Construction paper, faded at the edges, worn from being passed hand to hand. She held it gently, as if afraid the image might disappear if pressed too hard. It was a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, one small and one taller, separated by thick vertical lines that unmistakably resembled a cage. The shorter figure had a pink circle around its head. The taller one had tears drawn as large blue dots. Above them, in shaky letters, Mama y yo, Mom and me. AOC didn't need to explain where the drawing came from. She just let the room see it. The cameras caught it. The aides squinted. Tom Homan kept his gaze locked forward, unmoving. She let the silence breathe, and then her voice, calm but deeply rooted, filled the space again. This was smuggled out of a shelter by a legal aid worker who visited a boy in detention. He was 5. He hadn't seen his mother in 37 days. Her eyes scanned the panel slowly. The boy told her he drew this for his mom, said he didn't know where she was, but if she ever came, he wanted her to know he still remembered what she looked like. She looked back down at the drawing. Her thumb gently brushed the edge of the crayon marks. He didn't draw himself crying. He drew her crying. AOC paused as if to steady her breath. And I've been asking myself ever since, what part of this is justice? She turned toward the panel of witnesses. What part of this, of a mother waiting months with no information, of a child left to believe he caused his own separation, is law? What part is safety? What part is moral? She didn't expect an answer, and none came. But AOC wasn't finished. The mother, by the way, her name was Isola. She waited outside the ICE facility every morning with a photo of her son taped to her chest. Not because she thought it would change anything, but because she didn't want him to forget her face. She turned slightly toward the press gallery now, her tone more intimate, as if addressing the broader public that had tuned in silently behind screens. We say we're a nation of laws, but laws that strip away identity, that reduce families to caseloads, that allow a 5-year-old to become a file number? Those aren't laws. That's logistics for cruelty. The room was quiet again, but not empty. The air was thick with the kind of attention that couldn't be faked. Raw, focused, even reverent. Justice, she said finally, isn't a line item on a budget. It's not a bullet point on a memo. It's whether that little boy ever sees his mother again and knows she never stopped waiting. And then once more, holding up the drawing for one final beat, so I ask again, what part of this is justice? No one answered, but that silence, once again, told the story better than any prepared remark ever could. She laid the drawing down with the same care one might use when placing a photo on a gravestone. The color was still visible, pink for the child's face, blue for the mother's tears. But AOC didn't look at it now. She turned her attention back to the memo, the one she had circled in red an hour earlier. The ink had dried, but its meaning hadn't. Her fingers rested gently on the edge of the page. She didn't lift it this time. Just let it lie open, like an unspoken truth finally aired. We keep talking about systems, she said quietly. About procedure, protocol, standard operating policy. But systems don't make decisions. People do. She turned her eyes to Tom Homan. He didn't blink. He didn't nod. He didn't reach for the mic. You had power, she said, her voice steady but stripped of any theatrical weight. You had discretion, and you used it like a hammer. Not out of anger, not to destroy him, but because it was true. You didn't just authorize a policy. You gave it moral cover. You made it sound clean, like enforcement, like deterrence. But it wasn't clean. It was devastating. She paused, letting the truth settle not just around him, but around everyone in the room. You signed your name to something that changed the course of thousands of children's lives. Some who still haven't been returned, some who still wake up afraid. Homan remained silent, his expression unmoved but unmistakably tense. The weight of his own signature stared back at him, circled in red, impossible to look away from. AOC didn't press for a response. She didn't demand apology or force confrontation, because she wasn't there to humiliate. She was there to remember. I don't stand here to accuse for the sake of spectacle, she continued. I stand here because if no one says it out loud, we risk forgetting that there were choices. Real choices, and real people who made them. Her voice softened, but not her clarity. I wish I could stand here and believe it was just a system too big to change. I wish I could say it was out of your hands, but it wasn't. Your name is right here. And this memo, this isn't abstract, it's a mirror. She didn't hold it up. She didn't need to. And what it reflects is something we all have to live with. She stepped back slightly. There was no crescendo, no applause, just stillness. Because in that moment, AOC wasn't a prosecutor, and Homan wasn't just a witness. They were two Americans on opposite sides of a decision that would haunt the country for generations. And she didn't gloat. She grieved. Because you don't celebrate being right when what's at stake is a child's fear, or a mother who never stopped waiting. The hearing had gone quiet again, but it wasn't exhaustion. It was a kind of collective stillness, the kind that comes after truths have been spoken too plainly to ignore. And yet AOC knew there was one thread left hanging, one silence still unbroken. Not in the past, not in memos or drawings, but in the records that didn't exist. She turned her attention toward the end of the panel, where Inspector General Costello sat, eyes downcast but alert. Unlike others, he hadn't spoken much, but she was ready for him now. Mr. Costello, she began, her tone even but unmistakably focused. You've reviewed internal operations of both ICE and CBP facilities over the past several years, correct? He nodded. That's correct, Congresswoman. In your reviews, she continued, do facilities under DHS jurisdiction consistently keep track of detainees who are pregnant? He hesitated, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. Not consistently, he replied after a pause. The words didn't drop like a bomb. They dropped like thunder. Low, dense, impossible to ignore. A tremor moved through the hearing room. A few heads turned. A staffer in the back stopped typing. AOC didn't flinch. She just pressed forward. Do they track miscarriages? Costello blinked. I would have to verify that. In most cases, incidents are documented as medical events, but not necessarily categorized by type, unless escalated. So, AOC said, her voice narrowing in, we can have a woman lose a pregnancy inside a detention facility, and there is no standardized protocol requiring that loss to be specifically recorded? Costello looked uncomfortable now. There may be logs kept by individual facilities. Logs, AOC cut in, incredulous but contained. Logs are for inventory. This is about life and death. The room held its breath. She let that hang, then continued. Let me ask plainly, does your office currently have a complete record, national, centralized, of how many miscarriages have occurred in ICE or CBP custody over the last 5 years? Costello lowered his gaze. No, Congresswoman, we do not. It was the kind of answer that didn't need elaboration, the kind that hit harder precisely because it didn't come wrapped in spin. AOC let out a slow breath, then spoke softly, but every word felt like a stone laid in place. We keep track of facility budgets, of bed counts, of transfer rates. We know how many bottles of shampoo are in stock, but when it comes to women's bodies, to the moment they lose a pregnancy, inside a government building, under our custody, suddenly the system goes silent? She glanced briefly at her notes, then shook her head. A nation that does not count its dead cannot claim moral leadership. A nation that refuses to account for the lives it failed to protect has not just failed policy, it has failed character. She turned again to the panel. And let's be very clear, miscarriages are not footnotes. They are trauma, they are loss, they are a mother walking out of detention with nothing in her arms and no one being required to even remember it happened. She didn't raise her voice, but her words landed like truth that had waited too long to be spoken. We can't fix what we won't face, and right now we're not even counting. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching, this wasn't just about enforcement or legality, it was about human life reduced to paperwork and then forgotten altogether. And AOC was here to make sure that forgetting stopped now. AOC didn't look down at her notes this time. She already knew what was there. She had read these words too many times in too many late-night briefings, written by hands that trembled, translated by volunteers, copied onto legal pads because the women who spoke them were never given keyboards. Just cages, cotton blankets, and silence. She opened the folder slowly and pulled out a set of testimonies. These weren't from policy experts or legal scholars. They were from women, detained, unheard, erased. I'd like to read into the record several first-hand accounts collected by attorneys and humanitarian observers inside ICE detention centers, she said. Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it lowered. Ana, 26, Honduras. I was 3 months pregnant. I bled for 5 hours before anyone came. When they did, they gave me a bottle of water and said it was probably nothing. Maria, 34, El Salvador. I miscarried on a concrete floor. They gave me a sanitary pad and told me to clean it myself. I never saw a doctor. Fatima, 22, Guatemala. They said I was never pregnant, but I knew. I felt it. It left me in that cell and no one asked for its name. AOC paused. She let the weight of those last words settle. No one in the room moved. The silence wasn't respectful. It was stunned. None of these women were charged with a violent crime. Most had no criminal record at all. They were asylum seekers, held for crossing a border while pregnant, asking for help. She looked up at Inspector General Costello. then at the rest of the panel. And we have no official count, no system, no database, just anecdotal fragments gathered by nonprofits and desperate pro bono attorneys. She shook her head slowly. No names, no numbers, no justice. She glanced back down, gently tapped one page with her fingertip. Not for emphasis, but as if marking a life someone else had failed to recognize. One woman wrote that after her miscarriage, no one spoke to her for 2 days, not even to ask if she was in pain. Just fluorescent lights, 2 slices of bread a day, and a cot. AOC took a breath, almost imperceptible, and whispered, "You can't lose what you never bothered to count." There it was, the line that echoed louder than any outburst could, a whisper that cut deeper than a shout, because that's what made it unbearable. Not just the pain, not just the injustice, but the fact that no one had ever written it down. When a system refuses to document loss, she continued, it doesn't prevent suffering. It just makes sure no one is held accountable for it. She didn't need to say more. Her words weren't theoretical. They weren't political. They were human. And in their clarity, they revealed the brutal architecture behind the silence. A bureaucracy that tracked every ankle monitor, every bus schedule, every intake form, but not the lives that slipped away quietly inside its walls. She placed the testimonies back into the folder with care, almost like returning something sacred. If this country is going to call itself just, then it has to start where justice begins, with memory, with record, with recognition. And in that room, for just one moment, those women were no longer nameless. The hearing room felt frozen now, not in temperature, but in tone. After the testimonies, after the unanswered questions about miscarriages and missing records, there was nowhere left for the conversation to hide. But AOC wasn't done. She turned her gaze, slow and deliberate, toward Francis Cisna, the former director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He had been quiet most of the day, tucked neatly behind a row of stacked notes and memorized talking points. She leaned slightly forward and asked a question that was less about the answer and more about exposing how distant the system had become from the lives it affected. Mr. Cisna, where exactly are these records kept? You've served in leadership overseeing these agencies. Where would we find a centralized record of the pregnancies, losses, and medical trauma that have occurred in IC detention? Cisna didn't flinch, but he didn't hesitate either. His response came out with the sterile precision of a seasoned bureaucrat. Facilities keep logs, Congresswoman. That was it, flat, technical, as if he were talking about janitorial inventory. AOC tilted her head slightly. Her voice dropped half a register. Logs. A beat. You mean ledgers of loss? The phrase cut through the air like glass. Cisna blinked, then looked down, as if trying to find shelter in his papers. But there was none. Across the room, the tension shifted. On the press bench, someone whispered, "She said what?" Another already had their phone out, typing furiously. Within seconds, the phrase was on Twitter. Within minutes, it was trending. Hashtag ledgers of loss. Because that's what you're describing, isn't it? AOC continued, her voice steady but now undeniably forceful. These aren't logs. They're not harmless columns in a spreadsheet. They are cold, dehumanizing records that reduce grief to line items. She gestured faintly, as if to mimic how a clerk might record tragedy like clock-ins. And even those are incomplete. Cisna didn't respond, not because he had no words, but because no words could dress up the truth any longer. You kept track of detention room occupancy, meal costs, transportation rosters, she added. But when a woman lost her child in federal custody, the system couldn't even be bothered to note her name, much less her pain. Then came the final blow, soft but surgical. You didn't lose count. You never started. The hearing room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of formality. It was the kind of silence that follows something undeniable, something that breaks through spin and settles into conscience. Outside the Capitol, phones buzzed with push alerts. News anchors repeated her words live. Activists began quoting the line on signs. Former detainees reached out to legal clinics, saying that's exactly what it felt like. Inside, AOC sat back slowly. No smile, no satisfaction, just truth laid bare. Because what had once been a memo, a signature, a policy, was now exposed for what it truly was, a cold paper trail that never meant to lead anyone home. AOC sat still for a moment, staring at the documents spread before her. Memos with signatures, survivor testimonies, empty logs that tracked everything but the trauma that mattered. The air in the hearing room had turned dense, but she wasn't here to be crushed by its weight. She was here to turn it into pressure, pressure that demanded a response. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something different. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't outrage alone. It was purpose, sharpened by history and refusal. You know, she said, it's easy to believe that we are somehow past the worst parts of our history, that the tragedies of the past were one-time errors made in a different era, by people we no longer resemble. But that's not how injustice works. It doesn't vanish. It adapts. She leaned forward just slightly, anchoring herself in the truth she was about to deliver. We interned Japanese Americans during World War II, citizens, families, on the basis of suspicion wrapped in nationalism. We stripped them of their homes, their dignity, and then for decades we acted like it never happened. We ran the Tuskegee syphilis study for 40 years. 40 years. Letting black men suffer and die untreated, just to observe what would happen. We justified it with science, then buried it with silence. We kidnapped Native children from their families, forced them into boarding schools, shaved their heads, took their names, and told ourselves we were saving them. And now here we are again, separating children, losing records of pregnancies, allowing women to miscarry in cells lit by fluorescent lights. But we call it border enforcement. We call it zero tolerance. We tell ourselves it's different. Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it grew steadier with each sentence. We always say, never again, until again comes knocking, and too often we open the door. Silence. Stillness. Even the pages stopped turning. And then she went further. Let me be absolutely clear. This isn't just a moral failure. It is a policy failure, a systems failure, and a legislative failure. And we cannot address it with thoughts and prayers or committees that convene and vanish. We need law. She lifted a single sheet labeled in bold, Recommendations for Human Rights Compliance and Family Integrity in Federal Custody. First, she began, her tone resolute, we need legislation that mandates a real-time, federally maintained database to track pregnant individuals in DHS custody from intake to release. That's not a favor. That's the floor. Second, we must require trauma-informed medical and psychological care in all detention facilities. Non-negotiable. That includes prenatal assessments, emergency care, and mandatory follow-ups after any medical event. Third, we must create an independent oversight body to audit every reported miscarriage, every extended detention of a minor, every instance where ICE or CBP failed to meet basic standards of humane treatment. We don't need more memos. We need accountability with teeth. Her voice, though not raised, had grown unmistakably powerful, controlled but blazing. And fourth, she said, placing her palm on the paper, we need to build a national, bipartisan reunification task force, empowered by law, not by press release, to identify, locate, and reunite every separated child with their parent. Because the trauma we cause doesn't vanish with a case closure, it stays. She let that truth linger, then added softly, we do not get to forget what we never fixed. Her eyes moved slowly across the panel, some stone-faced, some visibly shaken. Let me be honest with you. This is not about left or right. It's about right and wrong. Because when a child screams for their mother in a cell built by our government, that scream doesn't care who signed the budget. It just echoes. The room had no answer, and she didn't expect one, because she had just said what most were unwilling to confront, that this wasn't a single administration sin. It was a pattern, and every time it repeated, it grew more efficient and less human. So if we are serious about never again, she finished, then it starts here, with policy, with accountability, with care that centers humanity, not headlines. The fire in her voice wasn't rage for its own sake. It was resolve. and it burned with a quiet warning that history doesn't repeat itself when we remember. It repeats when we look away. For a moment, the hearing room was so quiet you could hear the click of a pen somewhere in the back row. The fire in AOC's voice still lingered in the air, like smoke that refused to clear. But on the other side of the panel, Tom Homan adjusted in his seat, a small movement, almost imperceptible but deliberate. He leaned toward his microphone, placed both hands on the table to steady himself, and took one final breath before speaking. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," he began, his voice low but firm, "this is being framed unfairly. I never wanted children to suffer. The intention behind the policy was deterrence, to stop illegal crossings that put lives at risk. We believed it would save lives. We didn't want to break families. We wanted to protect the border." He paused, gauging the room. There was no applause, just the dull hum of tension, thickening. "People forget," he went on, "that border enforcement is about tough choices. That deterrence isn't cruelty, it's prevention. Every country enforces its laws. The United States is no exception." He looked toward AOC now, not with fire but with a practiced calm. "And yes, I signed the memo, but I didn't write the law. I followed it. I enforced it. That was my job." A few heads in the room nodded faintly. Not agreement, just recognition that Homan was trying to reclaim some ground before the record closed. But AOC didn't nod. She didn't flinch. She waited for him to finish, not out of politeness, but because she wanted no ambiguity when she answered. And when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It lowered. "Mr. Homan," she said slowly, "policies don't act. People do." She reached forward, gently tapped the red circle she had drawn hours ago around his signature. The ink hadn't faded. Neither had the implications. "This idea that you were just doing your job, that the policy floated down from the clouds and landed on your desk, fully formed, without agency, without choice, it's convenient, but it's false." He didn't respond. She continued, "You weren't following orders blindly. You were in the room. You had discretion. You had judgment. And when given a set of options, you recommended family separation. Not as a tragic side effect, but as a strategy, a deliberate, calculated tool." Her tone sharpened, but never lost its control. "You didn't just authorize enforcement. You helped shape the policy that turned trauma into a deterrent, that treated grief as a signal to others. Don't come here." She leaned back just slightly, locking eyes with him. "And your name is on it." The words didn't explode. They landed, slow, steady, final. And Homan, perhaps for the first time all day, didn't immediately speak. His hands tightened. His gaze dropped. Not dramatically, but just enough to betray the weight settling on his shoulders. AOC let the moment breathe. "You know, we talk a lot about accountability in this building, but what does it mean when no one is held responsible for policies that vanish children into systems with no records? No follow-up? No care?" She glanced briefly at the chairman, then back to Homan. "Because if the signature means nothing, then what does mean something?" Still, he didn't answer. And in that silence, the truth became louder than any justification. "This isn't about intent," she said finally. "It's about impact. And when that impact is broken families, unrecorded miscarriages, and terrified children drawing cages, then it doesn't matter how many pages the policy was. It matters who signed it, and you did." She let the final word hang, not as a weapon, but as a fact. "You can't wash your hands of it now." Tom Homan's face didn't move, but his eyes did, away from hers, toward a fixed spot on the table, then toward the far wall. AOC, meanwhile, didn't look away. She stared forward, unmoved, unyielding, not to provoke, but to witness. Because someone had to. And in that final exchange, the story had been sealed, not just as policy, but as consequence. And not just for the families, but for the man who had signed the paper. There are silences in politics that feel routine, the kind that fall between gavel strikes and roll calls, the kind that signal transitions or hesitation. But this silence was different. This one held weight. AOC had just finished speaking, and instead of reaching for her notes, or moving to the next witness, or even yielding her time, she simply sat still. The red-circled memo remained open in front of her, but she didn't look at it. Her hands were clasped, her eyes stayed steady, and she said nothing. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The room didn't shift. Not even the staffers moved. Even the clicking of keys in the press gallery slowed and then stopped altogether. Something was happening. Something intentional. 15 seconds. The air felt like it had thickened. No one knew if she had frozen or faltered, or if the mic had cut. But those who knew her knew this wasn't a lapse. It was deliberate. And then, as the 20th second ticked past, AOC spoke, softly, but with the kind of clarity that made everyone lean forward, even before the words fully left her lips. "If Lady Liberty weeps tonight," she said, "it's not for the flag." She paused again, not long this time, but enough to make the next words hit like stone. "It's for the files we never kept, and the families we never will." The line didn't need explanation. It didn't need emphasis. It stood alone, stark and echoing. Someone in the gallery let out a breath. Someone else wiped at their eyes. She continued, still quiet, still composed, but now carrying the stillness of a moment that had passed understanding and entered something else entirely. For every child whose name was never written down, for every mother who carried grief alone in a detention cell, for every lost pregnancy treated as inconvenience instead of tragedy, we failed. Her voice didn't waver. If anything, it became firmer with each sentence. We failed not because we didn't know, but because we knew and didn't count. Because we created a system that kept track of bed space, transport logs, intake numbers, but not people, not pain, not permanence. She reached forward now, not for a memo, but for the drawing, the same crayon sketch of two stick figures behind bars. She held it up again, not for the cameras this time, but for the record. This is the real memo, a child's drawing of a cage, of grief and of waiting. She set it down gently, like a memory returned to where it belonged. We will hear debates in this room about border security, about law, about order, but no law should cost a child their voice, no order should erase a mother's tears, and no country that claims greatness should rely on silence to defend suffering. She looked toward the back of the room, not at the panel, not at the press, but at the few empty seats left open for public attendees. They had names written on them. Some never filled, some never would be. I don't speak today to score a point. I speak so that one day, when another child is taken into a facility and asked why, someone will be able to say, "We stopped, we changed, we remembered." Her eyes returned to the panel, strong, steady, unwavering. Because silence isn't neutral, it's a choice, and history does not forgive those who choose silence when truth is begging to be heard. There was nothing else to add, nothing to debate. She reached forward, turned off her mic, and folded her hands again. And for a few more seconds, no one dared speak. Because in a room that had been full of policy language and evasions and legal footnotes, it was the quiet that told the truth. And it was the pause, 20 seconds long, that the nation would remember more than any memo. By the time AOC stepped out of the hearing room, the sun had shifted. It poured through the Capitol's marble columns in long, sharp streaks, cutting through the quiet like her voice had hours earlier. The hallway was crowded now. Reporters lined both sides. Staffers whispered into phones. Flashes fired off like clockwork. But AOC didn't stop for cameras. She walked past them, her pace steady, her focus forward. Outside, the protest had grown. What had started with a dozen people hours before had become hundreds. Some held candles, others held silence. But many held signs, handwritten, scrawled in bold marker and grief alike. "We remember the children. No more ledgers of loss. Count every life. Reunite every family." The slogans weren't hers, but the fire behind them was. From a distance, chants could be heard, low, mournful at times, rising only when someone read a child's name into the megaphone. Some of those names had never made it into government records, but they had made it onto cardboard and into history. In the digital world, the ripple had already become a wave. Hashtag ledgers of loss trended globally within the hour. Hashtag you signed it and hashtag never again. Means now weren't far behind. Clips from the hearing, her whisper, her pause, the red-circled memo, were being replayed on every platform, translated into Spanish, into Tagalog, into whispers in living rooms from El Paso to the Bronx. And then came the stories. A former DHS caseworker submitted a sworn affidavit to a local paper. She had kept her silence for years, but wrote that after watching the hearing, she could no longer carry the weight of knowing children had been moved without anyone documenting where they went. Her post ended with 6 words: "They were kids, we lost them." Another whistleblower released internal emails showing that early warnings about tracking failures had been ignored. Names, dates, warnings in bold that went unread. The messages were time-stamped, the replies dismissive. And as the public outrage swelled, journalists flooded into AOC's office, not just to cover her remarks, but to ask what came next. Her staff fielded calls from the New York Times, Univision, Al Jazeera, Teen Vogue, BBC World Service, even a parenting podcast that said simply, "We want to know how we let this happen." When asked for a statement, she didn't give a headline. "I'm not here to go viral," she said, standing just inside the office doorway, sleeves rolled up, voice quiet but firm. "I'm here to stop this from ever happening again." A reporter pushed further. "Do you feel vindicated by the response?" She shook her head once, then answered without hesitation, "I don't want fame. I want change." She turned back to her staff. A pile of letters from across the country was already growing on her desk. One envelope was from a church in Phoenix. Another was from a 5th-grade class in Oregon. A third was marked "Return to Sender," no forwarding address. It had no name, just a zip code near the border. She picked up that one first. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But something had cracked, not just in the system, but in the silence. And the truth was moving. Beyond the hearing room, beyond the headlines, beyond the signatures. Because when you name what others choose not to count, you don't just shift the narrative. You reclaim it. The hearing was behind her, but the weight of it hadn't lifted. Some stories don't get left at the Capitol steps. They follow you. They ride with you. They echo down familiar streets and settle into places you thought were home. AOC was back in her district now, walking through the heart of the Bronx, past bodegas she'd known since childhood, past schoolyards with cracked pavement and laughter, past murals that spoke more truth than most press conferences. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where sunlight poured over stoops and hydrants hissed with kids' summer joy. She was visiting a local youth center, tucked between a taqueria and a laundromat. Inside, the smell of paper, crayons, and warm rice lingered. It wasn't fancy, but it was sacred in its own way. A place that reminded her why she fought, why she hadn't stopped, and why she couldn't. They gathered in a circle, a dozen kids, a few teachers, and one community organizer, with more energy than should be legally allowed on a weekend. She wasn't there to give a speech. She was there to listen, to be present. One little girl, no more than 9 or 10, sat quietly near the edge of the group. She had on a lavender hoodie, sleeves too long, and bright white sneakers that looked newly gifted. Her name tag read Lucia, drawn in blue marker with a tiny heart over the eye. When the group was asked if they had any questions for their congresswoman, Lucia didn't raise her hand at first. But then, just before they were about to wrap, she stood up, nervous but steady. "Miss Alexandria?" she said softly. AOC turned to her immediately, smiling. "Yes, Mija?" The girl took a breath, then asked something so small and so enormous at once. "Will they ever say sorry?" It was quiet, honest, not rehearsed. Just a child asking something the country hadn't dared to. The room held still. A teacher at the back wiped at her eyes before the tears even had time to fall. OC didn't answer right away. She walked over slowly and knelt so they were eye level. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes they don't." Lucia nodded slightly, like she already suspected the truth. Sometimes the people who made the hurt pretend it didn't happen. Sometimes they hide behind rules or titles or papers. And sometimes they're too ashamed to face what they did. She reached out and took the girl's hand. But justice doesn't always wait for an apology. Lucia's eyebrows pinched, curious. AOC squeezed her hand just a little tighter. Sometimes justice starts with not letting them forget. The room stayed silent. It wasn't heavy. It was sacred. One of those moments that didn't need a podium to carry power. Just eye contact. Just honesty. That's what memory is, Lucia. It's a kind of justice. When we remember the people who were hurt, when we speak their names, when we carry their stories, we make sure the world can't pretend it didn't happen. The girl nodded again, slower this time, and in her small voice she whispered, "Okay." Later, one of the center's staffers pulled AOC aside and said, "You know she's undocumented, right?" AOC nodded. She had guessed. You could see it sometimes, in the way a kid stood, always ready to flee, always unsure of the rules. But Lucia hadn't run. She'd asked. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone in the room that the work of justice isn't just about bills and hearings and votes. It's about kneeling to meet a child where she is and promising her that her pain won't be erased. AOC left the center an hour later, stepping back into the Bronx sunlight. The city kept moving. Cars honked, trains roared, music blared from an upstairs window. But something stayed with her. Not the weight of the hearing, but the clarity of a girl who didn't want politics. Just the truth. And AOC knew. That's where the fight really begins. Not in the halls of Congress, but in rooms like that with girls like her, asking questions this country still hasn't answered. The corridors of the Capitol had emptied. The frenzy had died down. Reporters filing last-minute copy, interns powering down laptops, aides rushing to catch late trains. But outside, on the steps worn down by generations of promises and betrayals, AOC stood alone. She didn't rush. She let the silence settle. Her heels clicked against stone as she descended slowly, hand grazing the rail. Behind her the dome loomed, not as a beacon, but as a reminder. This was the place where policies became pain, where decisions lived longer than the people who made them. And below, the world watched, not through cameras this time, but through consequence. That final hearing had shaken more than just headlines. Staffers cried in private offices. Journalists stopped to reread their notes, unsure how to capture what they had just witnessed. And AOC, she had said her last word in the chamber hours ago, but her work wasn't finished. As she reached the last step, a light wind lifted the edge of her coat. She paused, not for drama, but for breath, for the memory of every story she carried that week. The letters, the drawings, the empty chairs. Somewhere across the plaza, a protester still held a sign. We remembered the children. The ink had started to run from the rain earlier, but the message held firm. And then came her voice, not loud, not angry, but steady. It didn't echo from a podium. It didn't rise above applause. It just arrived, clear and unflinching. The system isn't broken. She took another step. It's working exactly as designed. Another step. Her hand dropped to her side now. Open. And I'm here to redesign it. A pause, one more breath. With truth, with justice, and with every child they tried to forget. She didn't look back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because everything that mattered was ahead, the mothers still waiting, the files never kept, the names never spoken aloud in the chamber. Somewhere in the city, someone turned off their television. Somewhere else, a teacher wrote a new lesson plan. A father who hadn't cried in years sat at his kitchen table and wept over a headline. Change didn't always announce itself with a gavel. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, through courage that refused to blink. AOC walked toward the plaza, toward the noise, toward the work. There were no spotlights now, just the rhythm of footsteps, one after another. But the weight of what she had just done, the truths she'd forced into the open, the questions she refused to let die in committee, lingered in the air like thunder after lightning. The story wasn't over, and as long as children kept waiting, neither was she. This story isn't just about a hearing. It's about how conscience confronts policy. AOC reminds us that silence isn't neutral. By daring to grieve in public, she exposed what statistics never could, that injustice isn't just systemic, it's personal. Her refusal to let those stories fade speaks to a deeper truth. We don't need perfect leaders. We need ones who remember, who listen, who show up when the headlines move on. Real justice begins not in law, but in who we choose to see as human. What about you? Do you believe empathy has a place in how we shape policy, or should facts be enough? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.